Hey, I'm Cedric Chambers, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of the 3D Podcast, a masterclass where we share with you everything you need to know about how to transform diversity and inclusion in your organization as well as in your community. We're on a mission to amplify the voices of leaders that are making an impact in the world today so that we can have a better tomorrow. Our goal every episode is to keep it simple, honest, and transparent with you by uncovering the truths in diversity and inclusion with the hope of creating behavioral change, all while presenting it from a unique perspective. So look, if you're ready, get your notepad out, pour you a drink, and let's dive deep as we discuss the dimensions of diversity. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of 3D Podcast, where we speak to real practitioners that are making a real change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Look, I'm excited for our show today as we are speaking to Tash Koster-Thomas, an equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant and co-founder of Breaking the Distance. So just to provide a little context on Tash, Tash is an inclusion and diversity consultant, presenter, speaker, and LGBTQ plus activist who is at the forefront of many of the conversations impacting the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Tash uses her lived experiences and identity as a Black queer woman to provide valuable insights into how to remove barriers associated with diversity and constructively ensure that opportunities can be accessed with equity in both the workplace and wider in our local and global community. Look, I hope that everyone is ready to just soak up this knowledge, get your pen, get your paper out, whatever you take notes with your phone. Look, because I know I'm ready to soak this knowledge up. So let's get right into it. Tash, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good. Yeah, it's the end of my day, so it's chill. It's chill at this point.
I know. Look, it's not the end of my day, but we're saying we're gonna think that it is, and we're gonna have that same exuberance for the show today.
I like it.
Look, I'm excited for the topic today because, we're speaking about identity. Identity can sometimes, if not most of the times, be a sensitive topic as it encompasses so much: race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, socioeconomic status, ability, and much, much more. But, as we're going through and having that conversation and learning from you, we definitely, just want to get that insight, for someone who's doing this work every single day in this space. And I would say that it's also noteworthy to say that, when we think about one's identity, it shapes how they view themselves and how they interact in the world around them. And so as we go through this conversation, we're going to touch on that as well as a variety of other topics within the discussion. But for the conversation, right, the place I like to always start is for our listeners just to be able to get a background of who you are, just sharing a little bit how you got into the space, your career journey up until this point. I know it's probably not conventional, right? As you get a lot of HR people that go into this space and what just inspired you to focus on identity within your work. And so if you could just share a little bit about that, I think we can start there and we can take it from there.
Yeah, for sure. You're right. I had a bit of an unconventional journey into the EDI space. I'm originally and still, I guess, class myself as a professional performer, singer and dancer, trained in musical theatre, and I still do that today. That's kind of like my, I guess, professional background in some instances. And then sort of the first, I guess, real step into what I would now call like the EDI space is my wife and I, back in 2019, set up a platform called Breaking the Distance, which was around promoting, I guess, positive visibility of LGBTQ relationships. We wanted to be the representation online that we hadn't seen for ourselves growing up and sort of developing and coming out. And so that was kind of the first, I guess, real sort of entrance into EDI. And through that, being approached by different organizations to say, the work that you're doing is really good and we want to hear your lived experience a little bit more. And then I really sort of found a passion for this work based off of my own identities, I guess. As you said, I'm a queer woman of color. There's a lot of labels there, I guess, in terms of how we label ourselves in society. And so that was kind of the first shift. And then gradually I started really getting into design and delivery, but also supporting organizations, not just coming in and speaking about Pride Month and allyship, but actually broadening that. And it was, I guess, through understanding and developing my own identities that I really then started to get really interested in identity work itself as a whole. In some of those earlier sessions, just seeing the response of people when they started to explore this topic, but also realizing how little we explore it. We often explore sort of the effects of an identity, whether that's around unconscious bias and et cetera, and allyship, but we don't ever actually explore our own identities and how they inform our decision making, etc. So I've always found that really, really fascinating, and it's now sort of become the foundation of the work that I do.
Yeah, it's something that's, and just listen to your background and knowing that you are a performer. And I think that gives you this ability, right, to be able to even shift your identities, right, when you're on
Right?
stage
Yeah.
and be able to play the part, right? So let me just tackle this really quick. So in your performance piece,
Yeah.
what are some of the roles and some of the type of performances that you do?
So I originally trained in musical theatre. That's my real passion. So, anywhere from Forever Dusty and, playing real life characters, I guess, right through to I spent a lot of time working on Carnival Cruise Lines actually as a dancer. So it's a very different, right? Every single dance number you come out and do is a different identity, whether you're doing right now it's going to be a country and western number, now we're going to be in an 80s theme, so already that shifting. And then I guess more recently I have been in 2 tributes, so one that's around a Little Mix, the band, the girl band, and also the very, very well-known Spice Girls. So I have been playing the part of Mel B for a good few years, which is definitely an identity that my 7-year-old self is very, very happy to play.
There we go. Look, what's the show? America's Got Talent. Which one
Yeah,
is that?
that's
The
the
one she's
one.
on? Oh yeah, you're next.
Right?
Yeah, you're next. No, this is great, and I love this just the space, right? As you're thinking about your background and coming into this work and thinking about identity, right? It's something that we don't touch on a lot, as you've mentioned, but it shows up with us everywhere we go, right? It's something that we I won't say to a certain extent can't get rid of, which you probably can't, but we need to do more when it comes to embracing it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that when you said that very few people explore their own identities, that is something that we're going to talk more about it, but it's something that's true, right? It's almost like do we know who we really are? Sometimes, right? We see who we are, how we show up. We know our representative that goes to certain places for us. But then when it comes to who are we really? What really matters to us? How do we see ourselves in the mirror when we see ourselves, right? I don't think we explore that enough to really unpack it fully, right? And so when we think about this context of identity, and you explained a little bit, but one, just as a clear kind of definition so that people are grounded on this, I would say, one, what is identity? And then 2, can you just explain what it's all about? And how do you think the labels that we use in society and the boxes that we like to place people in impact the understanding of identity?
Yeah, it's actually interesting in terms of how, I don't think you can separate the two in terms of how we interpret our identity through society. I think that there's kind of synonymous. Quite often, how we view a particular identity isn't necessarily based on how we personally feel about it, but it's actually all the messages that are provided to us and sent to us from the external environment, right? So how I identify and how I feel about being a woman of color is, I can sit here and say I'm completely comfortable about it and I'm really proud of it, but actually it's also influenced by when I walk into spaces and I am the only person of color, or I walk into a space and I am part of the majority, right? The external environment's really going to impact how I feel about that identity in of itself. In its simplest form, I would say identity is the unique way in which we experience the world. In its kind of most base, I guess, if you want a definition. And obviously it's not something that's static. It's something that's always moving, always fluid. And I think this is where sometimes people can shy away from it or not wanting to tackle it, because we generally like to find fixed solutions for things. We like a yes and no answer, a black and white solution.
Yep.
And identity is really fluid. As I said, it can change based on your mood. It can change on your environment, the people you're speaking to. There are so many different elements. That's actually what I love about it, is the fact that it isn't so fixed. That's a massive part about, when I am doing deliveries, about really unpacking that. And it's not that we're going to come to the end of a session and say, oh, I understand everything about myself and I know all of my identities. It's more a case of, oh, wow, I'm aware now of how my identities are impacting me, or not in some cases, right? Depending on what those identities are.
Yeah. So you touched on that too. When you think about the sessions, right? So you are a consultant, you are in many of the conversations that are happening on the ground and trying to help others really understand the topic. And so in your work and in your practice, how do you approach it in your sessions? And then what are some of those strategies that you're using to help people gain that self-awareness?
Quite often I come at identity initially through the avenue of diversity, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people come into the session, it's diversity and inclusion training. And we're talking about diversity, but people I know enter the space a lot of the time thinking of diversity as maybe one or two characteristics. It's race and it's gender and maybe disability, if we can think that far. And
Yep.
actually, we are so much more in terms of our diversity than that. So that tends to be sort of the avenue that we come in to help us understand what diversity truly can be and is. And so it's kind of more of like an overview to begin with in terms of how we can talk about identity. So our primary identities, the ones that we see in policy and procedure, your protected characteristics, the ones that say it's illegal to discriminate against this person based off of X, Y, and Z, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these are the ones that we often think about, how we categorize ourselves. But then extending that, our external identities, the ones that we learn are taught to us, that come through the media, whether that's through the language that you speak, the religion that you have, the working style that you operate with, your communication style, your organizational status, the level at which you sit in your company, the hierarchy, all of these different identities are factors during our day to day. And when you sort of break it down for people, all of a sudden they think, well, I've never thought about the fact that I'm an introvert as being part of my identity. Or I've never thought about the fact that I'm quite direct in terms of my communication style as part of my identity. But I can absolutely see how it impacts my experience, but also how I interact with other people. And then I like to ask people questions. Think of an identity that you're proud of. Think of an identity that you think about often, one that you very rarely think about, one that you wish others understood about you, or one that no one knows about you. How do you answer those questions? But also, how do you answer those questions in different contexts? So generally, when I'm doing delivery, we're talking in a workplace environment. But are those answers the same when you remove yourself from the workplace and you think in the context of friends and family, or in the context of around strangers, right? All of these different things can suddenly awaken a whole other way of thinking, but also a whole different form of awareness about who we are and how we experience the world.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I think that even breaking it down that way, when you think about your communication style, because I mean, that's how people see you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how they experience you, right? And so that is a huge part of your identity. I would argue to say, and I could be wrong here, like when you think about the various different personality quizzes and assessments that are out there, that's doing more to inform your identity as well, right? And how you work and how you operate, and just being able to understand yourself more through those personality assessments is something too that's important to really take it to heart. I think sometimes we can go through and be like, yeah, I agree with it, I don't agree with it, whatever the case may be. But but it's one of those things, like it's an element or a tool to be able to use for the self-awareness, self-reflection piece to say, is this me? And am I
Mm-hmm.
showing up like that? And one of the things that you mentioned was, there can be situations to where you're showing up and you might be, one of few in the room, right? And I think that's where identity probably is, like the how we view it, right? As a society, it's like one of few in a space of where the majority is different. And so
Yeah.
when we think about the environments that we're finding ourselves in, how do those environments affect our identity and how we show up in those spaces, right? And I'm interested too, because one of the words that came to my head was like, I think it's called like code switching,
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that like popped in my head when I said this is that, how are we? How does it impact, right? How we show up? And I would love to hear, as you've navigated through your career, an experience that you may have had, right? As you looked at your identity and how your identity has shifted and changed in different environments that you find yourself in.
Yeah, it can massively shape how we show up. And I think it's really interesting how for a while we've had this concept of bringing your whole self to work.
Oh,
And what does that actually mean? And how appropriate or how right is that for everybody in terms of the environment that people are entering into? And it's, one of the things you mentioned, code switching and also assimilation. For those who maybe aren't familiar with the term, code switching is when we will change or shift our linguistic style to suit the environment that we're in. So in the simplest form, your phone voice. You pick up the phone and you hear a certain person on the phone, and all of a sudden it's like, "Hi, my name's you're speaking with Tash Koster-Thomas." Yes, that's right. And this is in its most simplest form. But what we find actually is that many of us are doing this in day to day, particularly in work environments, particularly in certain industries where perhaps our accent isn't acceptable, our dialect, certain elements of the way that we speak or due to our upbringing are seen as less. Right. And so we shift our way of communicating in order to adhere to what is perceived as the correct way. And then also assimilation, which kind of goes a step further. We think of this in terms of cultural assimilation. So somebody will adapt their own cultural style in order to fit into the mass or dominant culture. So if we think about that crowd mentality, right, that's a perfect example of assimilation where you have somebody who outside of one environment, let's say, for instance, a football game, is a perfectly respectable person. But when they're within this football environment and it's really loud and boisterous and somewhat aggressive, they take on that group mentality. They assimilate to that group culture. And we see this so often in work environments. We see it throughout society in general, but I think when we think of a workplace, it's an easier sort of example for us to, see these different things play out. And so it's a massive thing in terms of how we're constantly adapting. We're constantly playing chameleon individually and collectively in order to try and fit in to what we think the mold is. And ironically, a lot of the times that mold is created by us collectively, right? We'll all sign up to something, even though none of us really agree with it or want to participate this way, but we're all kind of too scared to break away from that. And we see it so often. The environment, I think, is a massive part of what can shape who we are and how we show up is the environment that we're in.
Yeah, I love the word chameleon, and you made me think too. The phone voice, like, "Hello, this is Cedric speaking." As soon as you find out somebody you know, bro, what do you want?
Right?
Right.
Exactly.
It's a whole different situation. It's like, look, but it's true, right? And I think that in being honest, yeah, some of it is needed because that's me. Let's say in customer service, right? There's a way you approach those conversations, that might be different than for someone you're meeting for the first time. This may be the only time you ever speak to them in that environment versus someone you speak to every single day, and you many more touch points, right? I would say it that way, right? So they can really understand, like, who you really are. And it was something, I'll be honest with you, I had to, early in my career, I struggled with it, right? Because I spent all my life in the South, in Georgia. Mm-hmm. When I got my first kind of corporate job, I moved to the Midwest. And this was the first time someone was like, "Man, you country." And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, yeah. It's like your accent, man. It's like, I got this country accent. I'm like, man, I don't know.
Right.
And what's the troubling thing is, like, one, when you're in an environment where I was growing up at, you didn't notice it. So it's not something that was like forefront in my mind when I thought about it. And then whether good or bad, it was something when I was told it over and over, it was like, I started to think about it more. Yeah. And I think that when I started to think about it more, it put me into a space to where, yes, I was being more conscious of it, but I was being more conscious of it from an element of trying to, I don't want to say please other people, but it made me kind of go into a shell, right? A little bit.
Right. And I think this is also, like, what you speak about there is a really key thing, is sometimes the biggest moment is how an identity is received, right? So if that person had been like, wow, oh my gosh, you've got a Southern, like, I love a Southern accent. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it's so good to have you here. Like, oh, just speak to me all day. Cause like, versus like, you country, right? That's a very different response. And it
Yeah,
then informs how you behave afterwards.
it
Right. So this
does.
is when I say, right at the top of this, when we're talking about identity and you asked about society, I think, we can have a perception of what our identity is, but actually it's the external environment that's actually telling us how we feel about our identity and either reinforcing it and supporting it, or sometimes the complete opposite,
Mm.
before we've even had chance to figure it out ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's just a note, right? For everyone listening, it's like when you do encounter, folks that, just have that something that is unique about them, right? In this
Mm,
space, right? How we approach it is a big piece of how they're going to continue to show up in that conversation properly.
yep.
Right. And how confident they're going to be, right. And how they're going to, feel within their own skin in that space.
Yep.
Let's say it that way. Right. And so when we think about that, right, in what ways, so we know about talking about society here, how do we shift the conversations around it? And I would like to, I think in this part, one, get some overall context, but two, you just gave one example of kind of how to respond, right? And now I'm gonna tell everybody when you say I'm country, I'm like, look, this is a better way you could have responded to me.
Right.
but but that's something that folks need. Like folks don't always know how to respond, right? And so when you're dealing with, people that may have strong accents, or you're dealing with people that may look, feel, act differently than you, how do we address those instances, knowing it's on the top of our mind?
Yeah.
Right? It's on the top of our mind. We see it, we hear it. We're like trying to not think about it, right? And still have the conversations. But what are some of the ways in which people can want to address or kind of just approach the conversation in a more receivable way when they encounter these situations?
I think it's around about having curiosity rather than judgment. And sometimes
Mm,
before you open your mouth to say whatever you have to say to that person, actually just taking a moment and pause and listen to the internal dialogue that's going on inside you. Like, what are the thoughts that you're thinking? What are the things, the assumptions you're making, the stereotypes, the boxes that you're putting that person in based on your own bias, based on the movies that you've watched, the thing your grandmother told you, the thing that your best friend, told you. All of these things are
yep.
influencing how we perceive the world around us. And actually, there's a tool that I often talk about in my sessions when we're talking around sort of overcoming or trying to reduce the impact of bias. And that's like flip it questions. Just in the moment in your head, like you have a response to somebody and you ask yourself a question just to flip the perspective. So, if this person had the same accent as me, would I interpret what they said differently, or would I put more value on what they said? Would
Oh,
I
that's
respect
good.
them in a different way, right? If this person was the same age as me, would I be making the same assumptions about them? If this person was the same gender as me, sexual orientation, whatever it may be, if I was to receive this email or this comment, how would I feel about it? Right? Just in the moment, actually just pausing and taking a moment to listen to that internal dialogue and question it, ask it. Okay, maybe there is a bias showing up here. Maybe I'm about to speak from a perception that is actually not even mine. It's a learned thing that I watched a show on Netflix and now I've decided that this is fact. And
Yep.
actually I have a person in front of me, and how about I give them the opportunity to share themselves authentically, and then I can form my own opinion.
No, I like that. I like that. You remind me about a trip I took to Southeast Asia, and we was in the mix with the people, living amongst the people. The comment came up. It was wow. You're very different than what I see on TV, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah,
Unpack that more, right? But like what people are seeing informs how they're going to receive you, and they're going to place an identity on you, whether it's you or not.
exactly.
And that's a tough thing, right? And so when we think about and this isn't work, it's work, it's outside of work, because you got different cultures that deal with this from a generational perspective. But when you think about that generational difference, right, and how identity is discussed, how is it, or how is it discussed, and how can we, when we think about being in the workplace right now with so many different generations and so many, like, folks have their views,
Yeah.
you have people that are like starching, like, this is the way it's supposed to be, or this is how we grew up, we don't talk about it. Like, how do we get into these environments and just begin to like break down those barriers to have more fluid conversations around identity when you think about the generational elements?
Yeah, I think how we speak about identity in 2023 compared to how we spoke about identity even like 5 years ago is in a very different space. I think that there has been this resistance for a while that it feels like, oh, identity is just claiming more labels. You just want to have more things and more ways to define yourself. And don't get me wrong, there are people that absolutely come at it from that perspective. But I think, it is more about understanding yourself. Your identity informs everything about everything, the way you see the world, the way you respond to people, your mood in of itself can impact how you respond to the world around you. And so I think now it's around evolving the conversation. I start every session by saying, when we're talking about identity, I'm not talking about this in a way to give you more labels and put you in more boxes. Not that at all. You can take or leave whatever you want from this, but it's about that self-reflection and understanding how all of these different things have got you to where you are. And for some of it, maybe there are certain identities or certain messages and things that you've taken on that actually you can release and let go of versus holding on to that as a part of who you are. I can sit here and say, I'm a queer woman of color. Woe is me. My life is really hard and challenging. Or I can say, I'm a queer woman of color. Look at my intersections. Look at how much of the world I can connect with and how much empathy that gives me for people, not just of my identities, but all the identities I don't have. So I think it's really about, focusing from that element rather than, oh, it's just another label, another tag. And I think the other big shift that we see now is, I mentioned the word intersectionality. Thank you, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, for that word. And I think it's really important to acknowledge it, that for a long time we've looked at identities in isolation. So you are a woman, full stop, or you have a disability, full stop, or and actually all of these things are interconnected. You cannot be one without the other. Your experience as a woman with a disability is going to be different to your experience as a male with a disability, or your experience as a parent versus being a male parent who is gay is going to be very different. And so that is where I see the conversations now really starting to evolve, is to understand our many intersections. And for some people, it feels overwhelming. Like, how do we think of everybody? There's so many things to think about. And it's not that I always say to people, it's not that you have to think about everybody, but it's that you have to be prepared to hear and to listen and to create an environment where people can share, right? So you're not going to create an event where you think of every single adjustment, but what you can do is ask the question, do you require any adjustments? Right. And then it's up to me if I want to come forward with it, rather than you trying to preempt and second guess all of my needs. That's impossible. But at least ask the question, what does support look like for you? That's the step forward.
I love that. And I think that when you say it and you're coming from a genuine place, folks can hear that. Folks can see it and hear it. And it's like, the way you approach the conversation, tone, structure, curiosity, like I said, curiosity versus judgment. I love that. You understand, or the receiver understands what you're trying to get out of the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that this is almost like when we think about these conversations around just meeting different people, we almost just have to sit with ourselves a little bit more and just say, there's a lot of people that I'm going to come and interact with. I'm going to come in contact with every single day. And when this happens, how do I make sure that I can show up in a way that is not offensive, in a way that is respectable, and in a way that really shows that I am curious to learn more about them? And I think that until we really have those conversations with ourselves, it's going to be difficult, right? Because you can see, you might see somebody with a certain name and then you say, where are you from? And you be like, New Orleans. Now, where you really from? Now, tell me where you really, like, how can you like approach this conversation a lot differently? And I think that if we spend more of that time on the practical nature of these are ways to approach it, I think it'd help us so much more, right? So much more. Yes, we can become aware. That helps us get through kind of the first barrier. Now the conversation is, once I'm aware, and like you said, you stop and you think to yourself, what are the thoughts in your head? What are some of those preconceived notions? Just before you speaking. The next piece is, all right, how do we give folks the tools to be able to now address what's in their minds? Because they, to a certain extent, sometimes, like I say all the time, because some things we should keep in our heads.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Absolutely. And that's like also not a bad thing, right? We don't have to say everything that we're thinking.
Oh man. I had to stop for a second. I was like, nah, some things we need to keep. We need to keep.
Right?
It's
So
and
true.
so when we think so thinking about this, right? Contextual, right, in organizations, right? So for the leader that is listening, for the practitioner, and it doesn't even have to be a DEI or HR leader, but for those who are trying to just move things on the ground within the teams, within the groups, what can individuals within organizations, because I know, as I always say, what can organizations do? Like, what can the individuals inside of the organizations do to foster just more inclusive environments, right? By acknowledging and respecting employees' diverse identities.
Yeah, I think there's lots of different things that you can do in terms of, we think of the traditional setting of, training and those types of things, whether it's like unconscious bias training and having specific days around, and I do think that there is definitely space for when we have those specific like awareness building days.
Mm-hmm.
Where, yes, that's great for kind of creating a general sort of idea around, what is the purpose of Pride? Why, what is the history behind Black History Month? All of these things. But actually, it's about creating an environment where, more than anything, we create a culture of feedback that is safe. Because how are we going to have these conversations? How am I going to be able to exercise my curiosity or even, challenge and speak up when something is done that made me feel uncomfortable? How am I going to be able to do that in an environment where either I feel like it's not going to be listened to, it's going to be shut down, or I'm going to be victimized? I won't. I will probably either keep myself quiet or eventually remove myself from that environment altogether. So one of the biggest things that I really advocate for is creating a culture of feedback where it's about saying, I know I don't have all the answers. I am human, and as humans, we make mistakes. I'm still learning about you, learning about identity, learning about my own identities, but I welcome, for my own development, your feedback. If I get it wrong, tell me. I will apologize and I will hear and I'll try and implement whatever suggestions you give me. And that has to be a culture that isn't just on one level, it's just the frontline staff that do it, or it's only from managers down to staff in terms of appraisals. It's everybody. And I had an example years and years ago when I actually worked at Apple, and I had been there for less than 3 months. I was still in my probationary period, and I was having a conversation with some customers, and a store leader came over and joined in the conversation. Now, they had 10 to 15 years of experience working with Apple, store leader, a lot of responsibility, and, a huge amount of respect within the store. And they were in the conversation, and some of the things they shared were incorrect. And I kind of felt a little bit blindsided in terms of the way the conversation happened. And afterwards, I went and found them and said, do you mind if I give you some feedback around, that interaction? The first thing they said was yes. And I was like, oh, okay. I kind of wasn't expecting that, but here we go. And I gave the feedback, and afterwards they said, thank you, I really appreciate it. And that for me was huge, right? I understand that regardless of responsibility and title, this is an area where we're equal, and that you're doing it because you want to develop yourself, but also it helps to support me. And I think that first and foremost within any organization is when we talk about culture and developing an inclusive culture, that has to be one of the key elements of it. Is it's a culture where we're all equal here, and we can provide that feedback in a way that we know it's for the betterment of everybody, not just one or two people.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. And it's, man, I think sometimes it comes down to just say, hey, we're human.
Yeah.
Literally
that.
Can we give each other grace? Like, can we just work through this together? So we're almost at the end here, but I do want to ask this one. And this is more, we've talked about, when they may say things, I brought up the situation where someone saying I'm country. For someone who's receiving that, how can someone respond to open up the dialogue and the conversation? Because I want to even give individuals who may have been approached in a way that wasn't correct, giving them the tools as well to
Yeah.
be able to respond, one, so that we can, kind of settle the statement that was made, but then two, be able to open the dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really a big advocate for this in terms of we've got into a culture of like, you can't say that, don't say that, you
Yeah.
mustn't say that. And that instantly puts this barrier, it puts a wall. If you're on the receiving end of someone saying that to you, you feel defensive. You feel like you have to justify what you've just said, and you probably feel really embarrassed, right?
Yep.
And you go away without any answers. You are none the wiser. You don't know what you've said, why it was wrong. You don't know what to say otherwise, and you're not going to ask any questions. So the thing that I really advocate for is, number one, again, that curiosity versus judgment, but really bringing it back and saying, look, I know you're not a bad person. I know it wasn't your intention, but that made me feel uncomfortable, right? We focus so much around intention and a lot of these things. And odds are, a lot of the time, the intention was not to offend. It wasn't to upset somebody. Quite often it came from a positive place, but the impact was negative. So let's talk about the impact. I know it wasn't your intention, but that comment made me feel uncomfortable. I know it wasn't your intention, but I found that question inappropriate, right? Or it can even be simpler than that. I'm curious to understand why you're asking the question. I'm curious to understand what you mean by that comment, right? Whatever it is that will allow us to connect to that person and maybe understand where they're coming from. I had an example recently with, I was out at an event with my wife and we were talking to a guy for a little while. And after about 10 minutes into the conversation, he asked the question about how we knew each other and obviously assumed that we were friends. And I said, no, this is my wife. And he had a very visual reaction to that. And I could have instantly judged him on that. And instead I said, look, I'm curious to know what you were thinking when I said it's my wife. And he said, well, I've recently moved to the UK. I'm originally from Saudi Arabia and I'm also half Guyanese. Now, both of those countries, it's illegal to be LGBTQ.
Yeah.
He then shared, you're the first two women in a relationship that I've ever met. Okay, now I have an awareness of where you are, and potentially the questions that may follow are going to be in a different headspace to if you are somebody who's born and bred, grown up in the UK. And, and you're coming with a very different experience, very different set of biases. And I can acknowledge that. So our conversation going forward looks very different. But if I had judged him straight away, then I would have stepped away probably thinking, don't know about that guy. He didn't seem very nice, and would have formed my own assumptions around him and his identities, right? So I think first and foremost, it's around really trying to create conversation versus building more barriers and blocks and everything else, and looking for what is the most productive way in this moment that we can actually talk and communicate and understand each other versus, just going to shout you down. And I appreciate that at times things can feel emotional. We can feel angry, frustrated, upset. That feedback doesn't have to come in the moment. We can take a moment to step away and feel all the feelings and come back a day or two later and say, hey, do you mind if I talk to you about a conversation we had yesterday and something you said to me? I know it wasn't your intention, but that made me feel really uncomfortable and I needed to bring it up with you today. It doesn't have to always be this, you're wrong, don't say that, you're a bad person, because I think that's, where we've ended up in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And no, I love, and thank you for just explaining that, because the conversations need to be had. And if we get, if we take the first statement of what is said and we don't really help unpack it, like you said, they're going to leave that conversation no more informed than they were when they came in, which ultimately, at the end of the day, for the person that made the comment or made the face or however it may be, they aren't going to get better, right, in their walk, in their journey on this space. And so I love that. And I think that for those who are receiving it, I mean, you have to really make a decision. Like, is this an opportunity for me to educate or to share more information, right? Or do I just flip off? Right. Or just look, the countdown is happening right now. Like Mel Robbins says, you got 5 seconds, 5 seconds in your mind when it's what we're going to do. And but that's a real thing. I think if we have more people that approach it that way, every opportunity is an opportunity to learn. And if we think about that, we can help more and more people, move forward in these spaces, right? And so, it's about starting from a common place.
Yeah.
Let me get you to a common ground, common understanding, so that I can't teach you the world in this short, discussion, but at least you can get more understanding and begin to hopefully help inform the way you connect and speak and interact moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, this is awesome. It's awesome. So look, we get to the end of the discussion. So for the audience, what are a few gems that have been helpful for you that you can share with the audience to just help them grow in this space, whether that be books, podcasts, videos, movies, etc.? What are some of those nuggets that you could provide so that people can really, after this episode, go dive deeper into the topics and really, really go learn more on their own?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a whole reading list and book list and resources like as long as my arm. But in terms of some of the key ones actually around identity, there's a really good book called On Identity by Amin Malouf, I think it's pronounced, but for sure that'll be in the show notes for you, which is one of these, books that you read and you're like, oh, I've never thought about. And he really goes into talking around how we feel when core identities are under threat and how that really can shift how we feel about an identity, but also how much we connect to it, how important it is to us, and how we show up in environments. And I think that's a really, really interesting aspect, especially when we think about in the workplace, what happens when people's core identities come under threat, and are we responding to that, and are we aware of that? And that can be threat that's interpersonal, but it can also be societal threat, right? So if you have somebody of a particular identity and there is a huge narrative happening globally around that identity, what does support look like for that person? How are they now showing up in that environment based on that? And then in terms of other resources, I mean, I tend to kind of also support specific identities. So I think it's really key to kind of delve in and start to understand more about identities that maybe you don't, that don't apply to you. So one of the really good books that I've read previously is Disability Visibility by Alice Wong, which is all around variety of different people with both neurodiversity and physical disabilities, as well as To My Trans Sisters around trans identities. There is Diversify, which is an amazing book by June Sarpong, which is kind of like an action guide. And then actually a really good one, if you are looking for an actionable guide to help within a work environment, is Inclusion Nudges. It's a guidebook which gives lots of different ideas in terms of how we can shift people's perspectives and way of thinking within the EDI space as a whole. So not specifically just focused around identity, but there are some great, great exercises in there that you can trial out in your environments, in your workspaces, in your teams, particularly for leaders. Those are just a few of my resources, as well as just jumping on TED and seeing them talk pops up.
Look, don't say we didn't give you the list now. Look,
literally.
Look, you get the list. All you got to do, right, in the world, in the technology world we live in, you just got to watch 2 videos, and then everything else is going to come to you. So
literally.
Look. So no, this has been great, and we will put the links to all of those books inside of the show notes, so that if anyone's interested, you can go to those notes and be able to go in and click and review or purchase any of those books. Well, look, this has been an amazing conversation. But before we go, do you have any shout outs, any parting words? And then where can people find you if they would like to dive deeper into your brain, your thoughts, and really, unpack this conversation a lot more?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you for having me. This is my favorite topic to talk about. So being given a platform to just chat about it for ages has been my happy moment. In terms of connecting with me, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Tash Koster-Thomas. Costa is with a K, Koster. You can also reach out to me on Instagram. It's actually where I spend a lot of time, tasht.uk. And also come and find the platform I have with my wife, which is Breaking the Distance. All one word, that's on Instagram as well. And we do have a podcast and a website by the same name. So just pop all of that into Google and we will pop up for you. But absolutely, please reach out and say hi. If I can support you in any way, I will do. However, I'll also warn you, as of this recording, I'm about to go on maternity leave and a new identity is about to come to me. very
There you go.
quickly. We are 6 weeks away from motherhood, so that's a whole new identity I will be exploring in the coming months.
It's gonna be fun.
Yeah, it is.
Look, got my three little munchkins running around. It's going to be fun. Like I was up at 1:00 this morning with a fever and didn't have
Nice.
any medicine, so I was rummaging the street for some, for some Tylenol and Motrin. Oh man, how did I wish I could have been asleep?
Right?
No, this is that's a true story.
I believe it. I believe it.
No, this has been good. Well, look, that does it for us. Look, thank you everyone for joining us on another episode of 3D Podcast. This has been Cedric, and you've been listening to Tash Koster-Thomas, co-founder of Breaking the Distance. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we look forward to seeing you and sharing with you on our next episode. Have a good one. Thank you, Tash. Awesome. Well, that does it for us. Thank you for joining us on another episode of the 3D Podcast. If you would like to connect on social media, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Cedric Empowers. And if you have any questions you'd like me to read or answer on the show, or just want to know more about my thoughts around diversity and inclusion, entrepreneurship, or just overall business, you can text me. Yes, I said text me at 770-285-0404. You'll receive content straight to your phone on a regular basis, and you can message back and forth with me. Not a bot or an assistant. All responses come directly from me. But look, this has been a great episode. Until next week, this has been Cedric Chambers, and you've been listening to the 3D Podcast. We out.